Chapter 21, Thunder Cave. By that evening, I had noticed I had a nice fire going, and the cavern was warm. Sapit sat cross-legged in front of the fire, chanting and pounding the drum. Earlier in the day, he had fallen into a trance, and he no longer answered when I asked him something. His chanting echoed through the cavern and sounded like a choir in a cathedral. He occupied the same space as me, but he was clearly someplace else. I sat down across from him. I gathered plenty of wood, but the dried meat that we had gotten at Satanic's corral was nearly gone. I was going to have to do something about this, but it would have to wait till morning. Exhausted, I lay down and fell asleep. Twice during the night I woke. Sapit continued to chant, and as far as I could tell, he hadn't changed positions. I don't know how he kept it up. The third time I woke, I saw light coming through the opening in the ceiling. I was famished, but I didn't eat. Sapit would need what little food we had when and if he came out of his trance. It was no time for me to try my hand at borrowing food. I put several more pieces of wood on the fire and stacked a small pile right next to Sapit. If the borrowing took longer than I expected, I hoped he'd be able to come out of his trance long enough to stoke the fire. I looked around the cavern one more time, making sure that everything was all right. Sapit continued to chant and beat the drum. I walked over and watched him for a moment. I took the amulet from around my neck and gently put it over his head, figuring that he needed it more than I did. I then took his spear and water gourd and crawled through the narrow tunnel. Outside the cave, the bright sunlight burned my eyes. Another cloudless day. The view from the path was spectacular. I could see for miles. Beneath the cave was the narrow valley. Just over the top of the west hill, I saw a few vultures circling. I figured that they might be soaring over something worth borrowing. It was several miles away, but it seemed like a good place to start. I walked down the steep path past Lumia's grave and the Boab. 20 minutes later, I reached the bottom of the hill and started across the valley. The only way to get where the vultures were circling was to climb the west hill. It took me an hour to reach the top. The vultures were circling over a small group of trees near Kopje. I watched a vulture circle lower and lower, then land on one of the trees. I didn't know what they were eating, but at least I now knew where it was. I walked down the hill very slowly, hoping that the kill had not been made by lions. I didn't think my borrowing skills were ready for that. When I got to the bottom, I stalked slowly towards the tree. There were several vultures perched on the branches. Under one of the trees, a zebra lay on its side. From where I was, I could hear its heavy breathing. It was obviously injured, but there were no predators in sight. Sapit hadn't covered this in his instructions on borrowing. There was supposed to be a cheetah, leopard, or hyena gnawing on the luckless prey. Where were they? For a long time, I stayed where I was, trying to decide the best way to approach the situation. I continually scanned the landscape for predators, but the only thing I saw were more and more vultures fluttering into the tree. I decided that I'd use the birds as my guide. They had a lot more experience at this than I did, and I was sure they wouldn't move in on the zebra until they thought it was safe. An hour passed. The vultures began dropping from the trees to the ground. The zebra's breathing was less audible, but I could see its sides still heaving. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I stood up and screamed as loud as I could and ran over to the trees, swinging the sphere over my head. The vultures scattered. When I got to the zebra, I turned completely around, looking for predators, but didn't see any. The zebra's eyes were wide open in terror. It tried to struggle, but it could hardly move once its powerful legs move its once powerful legs. It looked relatively young and healthy, and there weren't any fangs or claw marks on its neck or flank. What had brought it down? In a final attempt to get up, the zebra kicked with its hind leg, and then I saw the wire snare. Those bastards! They probably got no more than a few dollars for a zebra skin. They hadn't seen the wire at first because it was buried deeply into the zebra's leg. The snare was anchored around the tree, and every time the zebra kicked, the noose tightened, digging the wire deeper into the flesh of its leg. I noticed now that the leg was terribly swollen. Only the vultures knew how long it had lain here suffering. I thought about trying to get the wire off and letting the zebra up. But even if it could stand and walk, it wouldn't be able to run. And without its ability, its chances in the bush were zero. I squatted near the zebra's head and stroked its muscular neck. "I'm sorry," I said. "It's the only way." I stood and raised the spear above my head and plunged the point into the zebra's chest cavity. Blood gushed from the wound, spilling onto the black and white hair. I raised the spear again and brought it down. The zebra stiffened, then went limp. Sickened, I turned away just in time to see a group of Grant's gazelles streak past behind me. What were they running from? I looked in the direction they had come from and saw a plume of dust. A second later, a jeep came roaring through the clearing. I recognized it immediately. Poachers. If I got caught, who would take care of Sapit? I started to run. I heard the explosion of gunfire. I didn't stop. I ran to the Kopje and scrambled up the side. Their jeep wouldn't be able to manage the grade. If they wanted me, they'd have to chase me on foot. I glanced back and saw the jeep stop, and the men jumped out. More gunfires. Bullets peppered in the dirt and boulders around me. But I made it up and over the top. Where I was temporarily safe. I stopped to catch my breath and looked back. The two men were climbing up after me. My best chance was to run down the other side of the Kopje, then cut back towards the hill. It would take them a while to figure out which way I went. In order for them to catch me on the open savanna, they'd have to get back in their jeep. By that time, I'd be on the hillside in a familiar area. I looked in the direction of the cave. Above the east hill, a single cloud had formed. I blinked and looked again. It wasn't a hallucination. The rain ceremony must be working. I looked back down the Kopje. The men were still climbing after me. I had to make the decision. The poachers may have radioed for help. If I went back to the cave, they might track me there and capture not only me, but Sapit as well. I couldn't take the chance. I took another look at the cloud, still not believing it. If it was destined to get caught, it was going to be as far away from the cave as I could lead them. My only hope now was to put as much distance between me and them as I could. I dashed down the other side of the Kopje. At the bottom, I headed west away from the cave. I was sure the two poachers would see me from the top of the Kopje, but I didn't have any chance. 3 miles away was another Kopje. If I could reach it before they caught up to me, I might be able to find a place to hide. About halfway to the Kopje, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. My heart sank. I wasn't going to make it. I turned, expecting to see the jeep bearing down on me, but it wasn't there. The drone of the engine grew louder and louder. Where was it coming from? I looked up. A small single-engined airplane was above me. It waggled its wings back and forth in greeting as it passed. Had my father fixed his airplane? I watched it bank left. It cut its engines and came in for a landing. I watched as the airplane gently touched down on the dry savanna and came to a stop 50 feet away from me. The door opened and a man jumped out of the plane. It wasn't my father. The man had gray hair and a very dark tan and wore a khaki-colored safari outfit. He smiled broadly at me. I hesitated. What was he doing out here? Cautiously, I walked over to him. "Damn," he said cheerfully, "you are white." "You're an American?" I asked suspiciously. "Born and bred," he said. "What the hell are you doing out here?" "It's a long story," I said. "Right now I'm running from some poachers." "Poachers?" I nodded. "I saw those guys. They're on the other side of that kopje. You say they're after you?" "Yeah." "Well, unless they can fly, they aren't going to catch you." I started to feel a little better about him. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. "I just bought this airplane from a friend," he said, proudly slapping the wing. "I was taking it for a joyride," he laughed. "I almost stalled the damn thing when I saw you. It isn't every day that you see a white boy with a spear running across the savannah. I figured you might need some help." "You figured right," I said. "Do you live around here?" "I do now. Retired about 5 years ago. Me and the wife moved from Pittsburgh to Noroge. Big contrast, but we love it." I looked back towards the kopje, worried about the poachers. "The poachers aren't too happy with me. The last time I saw them, they were shooting." "No kidding." A look of alarm crossed his face. "Well, I don't want them to shoot up my plane. Do you want me to take you somewhere?" "Good question. If I had him take me back to the cave, the poachers might see us land, and they'd know where I was." I looked toward the cave. Sapit seemed to be doing fine without me. I'd go back to the cave when when things cooled down. "I'm trying to find my father," I said. "He's a field biologist, and his camp is supposed to be somewhere around here." "What's his name?" "Robert Lanza." The man snapped his fingers. "I've heard of him. Elephant researcher, right?" "That's right." "Never met him, but I hear about him all the time. Your old man's a pretty famous guy. My wife's a big fan of his. We support what he's trying to do for the elephants." "Do you know where his camp is?" "Not exactly," he said, "but I flew over a small camp earlier that could have been his. Let's go find out. If it isn't his camp, they might know where it is. Hop in." He climbed into the plane. "You can put the water gourd in back and the spear behind the seats. Those are Maasai, aren't they?" I nodded. "Wait until my wife hears about this. She was giving me a bad time about buying this plane. And the first day I have it, I save an American kid from poachers. She won't believe it. By the way, what's your name?" "Jacob." "Pleased to meet you, Jacob." He put his hand out and we shook. My name's Michael Donovan, but my friends call me Donnie." "Glad to meet you," I said, "and thanks. Happy to be of service. Now let's get out of here." He started the engine and pushed the throttle forward, bringing the plane around. He slipped a radio headset over his ears and shouted for me to do the same. "Can you hear me?" I asked. I nodded. "Great. We're off." He pushed the throttle forward and the plane bounced over the savannah, gathering speed. He pulled back on the stick and we took off. I was safe, and I might even see my father before the end of the day. It was hard to believe. If the poachers hadn't shown up, I might not have came across Donnie. Donnie leveled the airplane out and flew north, towards the kopje where the poachers were. "We'll keep it about 2,000 feet. We should be able to see everything we need to from this altitude. Looky here." He pointed out his window and banked the plane to the right. The poacher's jeep was speeding across the savannah. I saw the kopje I'd be running towards and realized that I would have never made it. The poachers stopped the jeep and watched us. I thought they might take a few pot shots, but they didn't. "If I had guns on this baby," Donnie said angrily, "I'd blow them to hell." By the look on his face, I didn't doubt that he would have. "So I take it that your father doesn't know you're out here," he said. "No," I said. "I wasn't able to reach him. I told him about my mother dying and how I got into Africa." "Well, you've got guts," he said. "No doubt about it." "Why were the poachers after you?" "I was in the wrong place at the wrong time," I said. Donnie laughed. "Been there myself a few times." "Say now, that's something different," he pointed out my side of the airplane. "That cloud above the east hill has grown much larger and